I love my family cat, but it's the most insufferable pet at night. Before I go to bed, I'll give him plenty of opportunities to come into my room because I know eventually I'll hear that light scratching on my door at ridiculous hours of the night for him to be let in. And every night, I give in and open the door and listen to his tiny claws tap across the room to jump onto my bed and fall asleep by my foot. Yesterday, I offered a kitten, but nope. He refuses me like he refuses me every single night. With my ego crushed, I closed the door and my heart. Cruel cat. And went back to bed. Maybe he resents me for moving out. Or maybe he likes to spend half of the night in a comfortable king-size bed that my little sister has snatched from me instead of a single bed in a box room that I have to now stay in whenever I want to visit. Shut up and go to sleep, I told myself, smiling. Last night, I was woken up again by the scratching, so I walked to the door, mostly asleep, and opened the door without greeting the bugger. I slipped straight back into the comfort of my bed and lifted my feet up. I could hear the tapping of the floorboards as he jumped up the foot of my bed and under the covers. I lowered my feet and put it on him. Normally, my heavy feet would make him claw at them until they moved, but there was no reaction. Just gentle purring. That, and the soft breeze from my open window that lulled me into a deeper sleep. I began to automatically do the usual thing of stroking my cat's head and back with my toes. My eyes opened fast. Instead of the dense, smooth fur, I felt something hairless and cold to the touch, like something dead. And when I reached the back, my toes felt like they were running across metal bars, and there was too much resistance and tug on the skin. My body froze. Its deep purring began to sound gargly and started to get louder and louder. Alarm bells went off in my brain and signals fired through my body to make it jump out of bed and reach to turn the lamp on. As soon as the light switch clicked and the room flooded with dim light, my back pressed against the wall near the bedroom door. My wide eyes burned as they adjusted and stared right at that thing, still at the foot of my bed, all curled up and naked. It was the size of an average adult man. It was very slender, with its almost transparent skin clinging onto every bone on its body like a thin, wet shirt. Its legs and arms were unusually long, and it had enormous hands and feet attached to them. The feet and the hands had disgustingly long yellow fingernails that were cracked on the edges. There was no hair on its body, and since its skin was so thin, I would faintly make out the contents of the inside of its body. It began to crawl out of bed with its arms reaching down on the floor first. I could hear the tapping of its fingernails on the wooden floors as he brought down the rest of its body into a squat. His hands were on the floor and his knees by his ears. It looked up at me with its big wide eyes, which were mostly covered by its black pupils. It was still purring, but it was starting to sound more and more distorted, which didn't stop until it began to open its mouth a few moments later. It was so bizarre. It should have stopped opening, but it kept dropping lower and lower. It also had no teeth, but that didn't make it any less threatening. It finally stopped and let out a meow, and then repeated a familiar voice. "Can I come in?" Its mouth didn't move at all when those sounds came out. It just stared straight into my eyes. Fear struck me even harder when I recognized the voice. When I woke up in the morning today, I told my mom that I must have been dreaming her asking if she could come into my room at 3 a.m. because she would never ask for permission. But also, what would she want to do at 3 a.m. in my room? We had laughed at my comments, but I definitely wasn't laughing now because I now know that it wasn't a dream. This thing was trying to get me to let it in. As it saw my face distort out of fear and my eyes pulling up, it began to smile. A toothless smile. The whitest smile I have ever seen. I began to tremble as it licked its lips and began to walk towards me in all fours. I could see the outline of its arched spine shifting as it crawled, and it didn't take long to reach me in that tiny room. Jerking its head forward, it pressed its icy nose against my skin and inhaled deeply. Its eyes rolled back, exposing only its whites, and its body began to shudder. I was so taken by fear that all my pathetic body could do was conjure up a soft whimper. It looked up as its thin, cracked lips curled back as its mouth opened to take my shaking finger into it. Once it was in, it closed shut. At first, I could only feel the wetness, and then I began feeling pressure pushing down onto my finger from above and below. When I found the courage to look down, it was staring right at my face while it's moving its jaw, like it was warming up its mouth. Then its eyes widened, and I felt it. Its gums pushing down, crushing my fingers so easily, like it were the cartilage on the chicken bone. Pain shot up my arm, and I opened my mouth to scream, but I could only let loose a long, dry wheezing, like my breath had been knocked out of my body. It smiled again while it's letting go. My finger almost looked flat, like it had been crushed by a hydraulic press. The shaking of its body began to get aggressive, and once it noticed that, it stepped back, all the way back until its back pressed against the wall on the opposite side of the room. Its final act began. It inhaled deeply and began opening its mouth again. This time, once it opened as much as it could naturally, it reached both of its long hands into its mouth. One of its hands clasped onto the gums on the floor of its mouth, while the other reached from behind its head and grabbed onto the gums from the roof of its mouth. It began to pull from either direction as horrifying noises of crackling and tearing ensued. Not once did his eyes leave my gaze. He held me hostage throughout the entire nightmarish scene. Once it looked like he could fit a human head in its mouth, it stopped. Then it began to walk towards me. I started to say my prayers as my vision blurred from the tears. I couldn't move. I was going to die. This thing was gonna tower over me, envelop its mouth around my head to crush me and consume me. I began shaking as I imagined the immense pressure on my head, making the blood rush to every orifice of my body, making it ooze out of my eyes, my ears, my nose, my legs. I could feel the familiar feeling of warmth, soft fur rubbing against my shins, purring. This time, I knew this purr. It was my stupid cat, and for some reason, although my body had frozen when my own life was being threatened, it became swift and mobile when I thought about this thing crushing my helpless cat. I looked down, grabbed it, and jumped onto my bed. This cat was fighting me and managed to leap out of my arms. He arched his back whilst the ginger hairs on his body puffed and began hissing sharply at the monster. I almost leaped at it, but I noticed the monster looked scared. With its mouth wide open, it let out a sharp screech, and before I knew it was out of the window. I have never seen anything move so fast. I was left, stood on my bed, frozen again. The cat jumped onto the bed like nothing happened, rubbed against my legs a few times, and decided to crawl into a ball at my feet to sleep. When it realized I'd need longer to thaw, my back slowly began to slide down the wall, and I was sat with my savior, snoozing by my feet. I stared at him for what seemed like an eternity, and daylight finally began to seep into my room. Eventually, I started to hear the hustle and bustle around the house as my family began their day, but I just sat on my bed, defrosting. Then I fell onto my side and fell asleep. I avoided my family all day under the guise of illness. I'm awake now, and it's night again. Earlier, I called my cat, and he did the weirdest thing. He came in and curled into my bed with me. It's strange, but whenever he's purring near me, my injured finger doesn't throb with pain. I've got the nightlight on, The door and the window closed, and my cat in my arms. I'm waiting to see if it comes back. Again. Thanks for getting to the end of this narration. I'm sorry for taking that big break, but I should be back now. If you guys could share the video, that would be awesome. Thank you.